They told her she'd inherited a ghost, a scrap of land so pathetic it became a punchline in the bleach-scrubbed corridors of the system. What waited there wasn't just a home, it was a reckoning. And if you've ever felt like somebody else held the pen to your story, stay with me. You might recognize yourself in what comes next. If you do, hit that subscribe button. This is a place for stories like ours. The day I turned 18 was the day I officially became invisible. 2 years I'd been a ward of the state, a folder in a filing cabinet, a name on a list nobody read. Case file 734, Era Vance, orphan. My 18th birthday wasn't cake and candles. It was an eviction notice from the only existence I knew. Mrs. Gable, the group home director, summoned me to her office. The room reeked of cold coffee and lemon disinfectant, the official cologne of institutional compassion. She wore that expression, the one engineered to look caring but drained of everything except fatigue. A face that said, quote zero. She pushed a manila envelope across her particle board desk, thin, insultingly thin. Quote one. The word just hung there between us, grotesque, out of place, inheritance. That was a word for people with family trees that branched and bloomed, not for a girl whose only roots had grown through the cracked concrete of state-run facilities. I was sure she was joking. My parents were dead. A car engulfed in flames on an icy winter road when I was 16. Grandparents? Some dim, underwater memory surfaced. A woman whose hands carried the scent of earth and lavender. But she dissolved from my life long before the accident. A ghost born from a ghost. Mrs. Gable tapped one manicured nail against the envelope. It's from your maternal grandmother, Eleanor Vance. The state tracked down her will. It's modest. She said modest the way a doctor says manageable. A word shaped to cushion impact that only sharpened every edge instead. I undid the clasp. Inside lay a single iron key, spotted with rust, and a folded document gone yellow with age. A deed. It granted me ownership of 1 acre in a town I'd never once heard spoken aloud, Northwood, Vermont. 1 acre and a barn. No house, no savings account, just a rectangle of frozen dirt and a crumbling structure hundreds of miles north, planted in the coldest seam of the country. I lifted my eyes to Mrs. Gable. My face gave nothing. I'd learned years ago that showing disappointment was wasted currency. Disappointment was the oxygen in this place. A barn? My voice landed flat as pavement. That's it, she offered a thin, pressed smile. Sometimes a fresh start is the best inheritance, dear. A piece of land is something. It's yours. It didn't feel like mine. It felt like a sentence. One last cosmic joke aimed at a girl who already had nothing. The other kids in the home, the ones still trapped inside, caught wind of it. It became the running bit. They weren't trying to wound me. This was survival language. We mined the absurdity from tragedy because humor was the only thing nobody could confiscate. They laughed at my tiny inheritance because laughing was easier than facing the terror of their own 18th birthdays. The day they'd receive their own hollow envelopes and be guided toward the exit. I gripped that key inside my pocket. Cold, heavy. A solid fragment of a past I couldn't decode and a future I couldn't picture. 1 bus ticket, $100 in state-issued transition funds, and a key to a barn. That was my launch into adulthood. Walking out of the group home for the last time, I kept my eyes forward. Nothing behind me worth seeing. Just a building packed with ghosts in training, each one waiting for their turn to be released into emptiness. The bus ride was a long, shuddering crawl through the skeleton of late autumn. The farther north we pushed, the more the world bled out. Tired city greens and browns, draining into a stark wash of gray and white. Snow started falling. Not the soft postcard kind. Hard, purposeful flurries that seemed determined to erase every landmark from the earth. I pressed my forehead to the glass and watched the landscape transform. Strip malls and gas stations surrendered to thick corridors of pine and birch, their branches already bowing under the weight of white. The bus carried almost nobody. Me and a handful of strangers, each sealed inside our own silence. Mine wasn't silence, though. Mine was anger. a low, steady burn behind my ribs. Why would she do this? This grandmother, Eleanor, why leave me a worthless scrap of land in some frozen corner of the world? If she'd cared even slightly, she would have left money, a letter, some scrap of explanation for why she'd been a phantom through every year of my life, especially after my parents were gone. The deed felt like a slap. The key, a riddle I lacked the strength to untangle. All I had was her name, a ghost bequeathing me a ghost of a property. I pressed my forehead to the frigid window glass. The engine's vibration hummed low, matching the dull drone inside my own skull. My plan, if that word even applies, was brutally simple. Reach Northwood, find a real estate agent, sell the land for whatever scraps it could fetch, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 if fortune decided to glance my way, then take that cash and vanish into some city, a cheap apartment, a dishwashing job, survival. That was the only curriculum life had ever handed me. I tugged the deed from my backpack. The paper was thick, almost like fabric. The ink faded to near whisper. I scanned the legal description, a tangle of coordinates and boundary lines that meant absolutely nothing. Then folded inside the crease something I'd overlooked before, a smaller, newer sheet of paper. Not from my grandmother, from a law firm, Blackwood and Sons, real estate development. The letter was polished, corporate, and stripped of any human warmth. Addressed to the estate of Eleanor Vance. It stated they were aware of the property transfer and stood ready with a generous offer to acquire the land for a larger development project. $5,000. To me, that number was oxygen, a skeleton key to a locked door. Enough to rent an apartment for a year, enough to buy groceries, enough to simply breathe. The letter was dated 1 week prior. They'd clearly been monitoring the probate process. Efficient, calculated, predatory. My gut reaction hit like a wave, pure, flooding relief. Here it was, my escape hatch. I wouldn't need to spend more than a single day in Northwood. Find their office, sign whatever needed signing, catch the next bus out. But then a second thought edged in, a stubborn, jagged splinter of suspicion. Why the urgency? Why would a development company chase down one tiny, isolated acre with nothing on it but a collapsing barn? 5,000 wasn't generous for land someone actually wanted. It was a lowball bid for something they needed badly, for reasons they weren't sharing. It felt too clean, and life had beaten into me that nothing clean ever stayed that way. The bus groaned, decelerating as it rolled into a small, snow-dusted depot. One sign stood alone in the cold. Welcome to Northwood, population 487. The doors hissed apart. Arctic air struck me like a fist. A cold so deep it had edges, had teeth. I stepped down, my thin jacket doing nothing against the wind. The town lay hushed beneath a heavy quilt of fresh snow. The sky pressed down, solid, pale, unforgiving. I was the only passenger who stepped off. The bus pulled away behind me, red taillights dissolving into the swirling white. And then, nothing. Just me, utterly, completely alone. I stood motionless for a long moment. The developer's letter in one hand, the iron key cold against my thigh through my pocket. 2 paths stretched out before me. Take the easy money and disappear, or walk into the mystery of this place, this inheritance. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the decision belonged to me. That was the most frightening part. I yanked my collar higher against the wind gnawing at my face and started toward the town's lone, blinking traffic light. My boots broke through pristine snow with each step. Northwood wasn't really a town, more like the rough sketch of one. A main street lined with a handful of 2-story buildings, their facades scoured raw by decades of brutal winters. A general store, a post office, a diner with a neon sign buzzing and flickering. A small office bearing a shingle that read, Thompson Law. Beyond that, houses, modest, solid, smoke threading upward from their chimneys like slow exhales. Everything lay muted under the snow. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. I headed for the general store first. A bell rang overhead as I shouldered open the heavy wooden door. Warm air spilled over me. Wood smoke, fresh coffee, sawdust. An old man, thick white beard, suspenders, reading glasses, glanced up from his newspaper behind the counter. His eyes were sharp above those lenses, expression flat but measuring. Quote 9, he said, not a question. Quote 10, I managed. My voice sounded thin against all that quiet. Quote 11, something shifted in him. His spine straightened. His eyes went soft. Recognition, maybe, or pity. He removed his glasses, polished them slow with a cloth. Quote 12, quote, he murmured, voice like gravel rolling downhill. Quote 13, his gaze traced my face, searching. Quote 14, I had no response for that. It was like someone pressing a puzzle piece into my palm, one I never knew was missing. Quote 15, quote, the words escaped before I could catch them. Bill shook his head, slow and deliberate. Quote 16, quote, he pointed toward the back of the store. His eyes dropped to my thin jacket, my worn-out sneakers. I shook my head. My $100 had to stretch. A taxi was out of the question. Bill let out a sigh, heavy, almost fatherly. Quote 19. I started to protest. He shut it down with a wave. Quote 20. I obeyed. My hands trembled as I filled a styrofoam cup with dark, steaming liquid. The heat crept into my fingers, a small mercy in a world that felt enormous and freezing. While I sat waiting, a sleek black SUV rolled up outside. The man who stepped out wore a tailored overcoat and expensive shoes, every inch of him wrong for this town. He entered the store, eyes scanning the room before settling on me. Something about the way he moved made my skin tighten. Quote 21, he said, voice like polished stone. Quote 22, he said. He extended a hand. I left it hanging. The developer. Quote 23. Bill came out from behind the counter, positioning himself between us, casual but deliberate. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 24, underscore, underscore. Corian's smile never touched his eyes. Of course, just wanted to welcome her to Northwood. And reminder, our offer is clean, simple. That property is a liability. We take it off your hands. You walk away with cash by tomorrow. He pressed a business card into my fingers. It's the smart play. A curt nod to Bill, and he was gone. The bell chimed behind him. The silence he left was thick, heavy. Blackwood's been after that land for years, Bill said, voice low and tight. Eleanor never sold. Not for any price. He fixed me with a serious look. Be careful, kid. That man's smile is as fake as a $3 bill. There's a reason they want that land so bad. And it ain't for the view. An hour passed. Bill locked the store and walked me to his old rattling pickup. The heater blasted warm, dusty air as we pulled out of town. Headlights carved through falling snow. Beyond the windows, nothing but swirling white and black. We rode in silence, windshield wipers thumping their rhythm. Tires crunching through packed snow. She was a good woman, your grandmother, Bill said at last, eyes fixed on the road. Tough as old leather, but good. Town figured she was eccentric, a hermit. She saw things other people didn't. We turned onto a narrower road, unplowed. The truck groaned, tires clawing for grip. Then I saw it. Set back from the road, half swallowed by snow-heavy pines, the barn. Larger than I'd pictured. Gray wood, weathered and scarred. The roof bowed at its center like a broken back, and one of the main doors dangled at an angle from rusted hinges. This wasn't a structure. It was a shrine to neglect. The thing looked cursed. Bill eased the truck to a halt. Here we are, he said quietly. Home sweet home, I suppose. His eyes found mine. You certain you want to stay out here alone? I could drive you back into town, get you a room at the inn. I stared at the barn. Dark, desolate, threatening. But it belonged to me. The only thing on this entire earth that did. I'll manage, I said, forcing a steadiness into my voice I didn't possess. He gave a slow nod, unconvinced. I told him I would. I climbed out, my boots plunging into deep snow. Bill held his position until I reached the path leading to the barn entrance. Then he reversed, headlights dragging across the face of the building before vanishing down the road. What followed was silence so total it had weight. Just me, the snow coming down, and that massive, mute barn. I pulled a breath through my teeth. ice scraping the inside of my lungs, and fished the old iron key from my pocket. Heavy, ancient in my gloved hand. I approached the smaller side door, the one still attached to its frame. The lock had seized with rust and cold. One terrible second passed where the key refused to turn, then metal shrieked against metal and the mechanism surrendered. The door drifted inward with a low moan, revealing nothing but black. Stale air poured out, cold, carrying the smell of old hay, of dust, of something harder to name, something like time preserved. I stood at the threshold, frozen between decisions. This was the question made physical: tomb or beginning? I clicked on the small flashlight hanging from my keychain. Its beam was pitiful against that darkness. I stepped through. Behind me, the door swung closed with a heavy, definitive thud. My tiny light carved a weak line through the barn's interior, and I realized the space was enormous, far larger than the outside suggested. The ceiling vaulted upward into a cathedral of rafters, disappearing into shadow. Dust particles spun through the beam like panicked ghosts. To my left, old animal stalls, their wooden gates bleached gray by decades. To my right, a tangle of shapes hidden beneath dusty tarps. Farm equipment, stacked lumber, objects I couldn't name. The floor was packed earth, cold and unyielding under my boots. Directly ahead, at the barn's far wall, a partitioned room had been built into the larger structure. A workbench sat just outside it, buried under tools and glass jars stuffed with screws and nails. Everything wore a thick skin of dust. The quiet here was different from outside. Not just silence, pressure, the accumulated weight of unspoken years. I felt like a trespasser in a place that had been holding its breath for a long, long time. I began my search with discipline, sweeping the flashlight across every surface. Anything that might tell me about the woman who had lived here, who had died here. Anything that might crack the mystery open. The stalls held nothing but dry, crumbling straw. The equipment had rusted into a single, fused mass. I dragged back one of the canvases and choked as dust erupted into the air. Beneath it sat an ancient tractor, red paint weathered to a dull rose, tires split and deflated, a relic, a fossil, nothing of value. Nothing that explained why a developer would throw $5,000 at this place. My stomach dropped. Corgan had been right. This was a burden, not a gift. I should have taken the money and walked. What was I doing out here? Alone, freezing, stumbling through the dark after a dead woman's shadow. The anger surged fresh. My grandmother had left me an empty husk, a cruel, hollow joke. I moved toward the workbench. The tools were old but maintained with obvious care, arranged in deliberate order that contradicted the chaos everywhere else. Wrenches and hammers hung from a pegboard, each one outlined in white paint so you'd know exactly where it belonged. Jars of hardware bore labels in a thin, elegant handwriting. This was her place. I knew it the way you know a room belongs to someone even after they're gone. My fingers traveled the scarred surface of the bench, reading the grooves and nicks like a language. A lifetime of labor pressed into wood. Then my flashlight caught something metallic. Hidden behind those jars sat a small tin box, the sort once used for tea or biscuits. Faded bluebirds decorated its surface. No lock. My fingers, stiff and numb from the cold, pried the lid open. Inside, resting on yellowed cotton, lay a single photograph and a folded slip of paper. Black and white, edges curled by decades. A young woman with dark, wavy hair and a smile that was shy and defiant at once. She held a baby in her arms. She had my eyes. Bill had been right. Eleanor, my grandmother. And the baby? That was my mother. I stared at the image while something ancient and nameless opened in my chest. I had never seen a photograph of my mother as an infant, never held proof that she had once been small, brand new, cradled by someone who loved her. I unfolded the paper. The same elegant hand that labeled those jars had written a single message, quote, 38, quote. I read it 3 times. 4. The heart of the house is not in the house. Trust the grain. A riddle, a deliberate clue. My grandmother hadn't abandoned me to nothing. She'd left a trail. Hope. thin, cautious, barely breathing, sparked somewhere behind my ribs. This wasn't random debris. This was intentional. I swept the flashlight across the workbench again, different eyes now, not browsing, hunting. Where the work is done. This bench, right here. Trust the grain. I studied the thick oak surface, wide planks joined tight, their grain flowing in dark and pale ribbons. My fingers traced every inch, searching for irregularity, a loose board, a hidden joint. Nothing. I shifted the beam to the front drawers, opened each one. Tools, wire coils, spare parts, all mundane. I nearly quit. Then my light grazed something wrong near the base. One of the heavy legs was built from laminated pieces. On its left side, the grain didn't flow right, subtle, almost invisible. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My knees hit the frozen ground. My pulse climbed. I pressed the wood. Solid. I traced the seam with my fingertips, hunting a latch, a catch, a trigger. Nothing. Trust the grain. I leaned closer. The grain ran downward everywhere except one spot. A tiny knot created a swirl no bigger than my thumb. Instinct took over. I pressed my thumb into that knot's center. A faint click. The section with the mismatched grain popped outward, 1 inch. Not a drawer, a compartment. Deep. A dark hollow carved into the solid leg. My fingers reached in and met something smooth and cold. I drew it out. A heavy journal bound in leather. My grandmother's journal. This was the heart. This was the story I'd spent my whole life starving for. I sat on that frozen ground, flashlight barely reaching the worn cover, and turned to the first page. Elegant, spidery handwriting filled it edge to edge. As I began reading, the cold pulled back. The darkness shrank. The crushing mass of my own isolation loosened its grip, displaced by the voice of a woman I had never met, who was about to reshape everything I believed. My hands shook against the leather. The first entry was dated more than 30 years ago. Ink slightly faded, but every word burned with a love so fierce it radiated warmth against that barn's brutal chill. My little bird, my Sarah, it began. My mother's name. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 40, underscore, underscore. Page after page. My mother's first steps, her first words. The ridiculous way she mangled the word spaghetti. I wasn't reading about the tragic woman killed in a car accident. I was meeting a vibrant, laughing girl, cherished, adored by her own mother. Eleanor's love for her daughter spilled from every sentence. But as the years turned in that journal, something shifted. A new name crept onto the pages. Rick, my father. Eleanor's first mentions of him carried a cautious warmth. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 41, underscore, underscore. That prayer went unanswered. Hope soured into dread. The entries grew shorter, clipped, guarded. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 42, underscore, underscore. My throat closed around a breath I couldn't finish. I knew my father had a temper. Dim, smoke-colored memories lived in me, shouting that rattled walls, my mother's muffled sobs. But I never understood the full scope. My grandmother witnessed every stage of it. She documented her pleas, her desperate campaigns to pull my mother free, to bring her home. But my mother was snared, pinned between devotion and terror, repeating his apologies back like prayers, swearing he'd change. Then came the entry about me. Sarah is pregnant, she told me today with eyes full of desperate, terrified hope. She believes a baby will heal him. I know better. A child won't save him. It will only hand him another weapon, another soul to shatter. I have to act. I cannot watch him destroy this one too. I set the journal down, couldn't read another word. Nausea and grief rolled through me in one thick wave. I sat motionless in the dark, flashlight beam shaking in my grip, cold earth pulling the warmth from my bones. Everything I'd believed was wrong. I had built a story where my grandmother was the villain, the one who turned away, who didn't care. The truth was the opposite. She had been fighting, watching from the margins, heart fracturing in slow motion. The journal laid out her plan in painstaking detail. Eleanor began hoarding money, selling off pieces of the farm, building an escape route for my mother and me. But Rick tightened his grip, grew more paranoid. He severed my mother from her family, dragged her from town to town like cargo. Eleanor's letters came back unopened. Her calls rang into nothing. Then a darker thread wove itself into the pages. Rick had entangled himself with a man named Arthur Blackwood, founder of Blackwood and Sons. My blood turned to ice water. This was no accident. They weren't simply developers. Eleanor's journal revealed Blackwood operated a loan sharking ring beneath that polished surface, feeding on desperate people. Rick owed him heavily. And Blackwood converted that debt into servitude, forcing Rick to intimidate, to run errands no honest person would touch. The barn, this land, it sat in my grandmother's name, the one asset Rick couldn't reach. Blackwood wanted it, saw it as payment for Rick's mounting debt. He leaned on Rick to pressure Eleanor into selling. Quote, 44 one entry read. Quote, 45 The final entries came in jagged, trembling handwriting. My parents were dead. Eleanor poured her grief onto those pages, a devastation so raw it bled through the paper into my hands. But tangled through that grief was something worse. Guilt. Quote, 46 After the accident, she fought for custody. Blackwood crushed that fight before it started. He had roots in the system, connections. He painted Eleanor as unstable, a reclusive old woman, unfit to raise anyone's child. He made certain I vanished into foster care, swallowed whole by the state. He did it with surgical precision. Isolate the girl. Sever every thread connecting her to the truth. Let her grow up believing she was abandoned, unwanted. Then, when she turns 18, broke, desperate, alone, she'll sell the one thing he could never take by force. My grandmother's land. A long game, patient, merciless. And I had been the pawn at its center. I shut the journal. My entire body vibrated with a rage so pure and cold, it felt like swallowing shards of ice. They hadn't merely dismissed my inheritance. They had engineered my entire childhood of isolation and loss, manufactured every lonely night just to pry this land from my hands. The grief I felt for the grandmother I never knew was bottomless. She hadn't abandoned me. She'd been trying to shield me from beyond the grave. The journal, the key, the barn, none of it was an inheritance. It was a weapon. And sitting there in that cold silence, something turned over inside me. Fear still lived in my chest, but it had changed shape, sharpened itself into a blade, became something I could use. Have you ever stood in a moment like that, where everything you believed gets ripped away and suddenly the world snaps into brutal, terrifying focus? That kind of moment either shatters you or hammers you into steel. If you've walked through that fire, I need you to hear me. You are not alone. This place exists for people who've been through it and clawed their way out. If this is landing somewhere real, take a second. Hit subscribe, drop a comment. Let us know you're here. Because what happens next is the part where I stopped being a piece on someone else's board. I chose to fight. Rage kept me warm that night. Sleep never came. I sat curled in the barn's darkness, a moth-eaten wool blanket pulled from an old trunk draped over my shoulders. And I read that journal front to back. Then I read it again. I was learning my own history by heart, turning truth into ammunition. When the first pale light of morning bled through the gaps in the barn walls, I found it. The final pages. My grandmother was no victim. She was a soldier. She knew Blackwood was a criminal, but couldn't prove it. Local police belonged to him. So she built her own case. Quote 47, quote, she wrote, quote 48, quote, for Sarah, and for me. The journal never revealed where she stashed the evidence. But the very last page held another clue, written in a trembling hand probably days before she died. Quote 49. I rose to my feet, joints locked with cold. The barn didn't sit on a modern concrete slab. It rested on old stone, massive granite blocks hauled from the very quarry Blackwood now used for his dirty work. I grabbed a heavy iron pry bar off the workbench and made my way to the walled-off room at the back. The one I'd noticed earlier. Maybe it had been her workshop. Maybe a root cellar for preserves. Small space, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. I tapped each stone in the floor, listening. Thud, thud, thud. All solid. I was ready to quit when I noticed one stone dead center in the room. Same size as the others, same color. But its edge carried a small, intentional chip, a tiny crescent moon carved into the surface. The note from the tin box came flooding back. Trust the grain. Same principle. A flaw that wasn't a flaw. A marker disguised as damage. I jammed the pry bar's tip into the seam beside the marked stone. Threw every pound I had into it. Nothing moved. The iron bar groaned. My arms burned. Then, a low, grinding moan of stone dragging against packed earth. The flagstone shifted, rose, thick, heavy granite. Beneath it, a dark square opening, a cavity lined with metal, a small fireproof safe buried in the ground beneath the floor. And resting on top of the safe, another letter. Sealed envelope, my name across the front. Ada. I sank back on my heels. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my teeth. This was the final piece, the real inheritance. I ripped the envelope open, several pages inside, covered in that familiar, elegant handwriting. Quote 50, it began. Quote 51. She laid it all out. Blackwood's operation ran deeper than loan sharking. He'd been using the quarry as a dump site for illegal industrial waste, poisoning the water table beneath the entire area. Her farm. My farm. It sat on one of the last clean wells left. That's what he was after. Not the dirt, not the timber, the water rights. His plan was elegant in its cruelty. Acquire her property, contaminate her well, then sell the cleanup contract back to the state for millions, all while the dumping continued in secret. A long, patient, diabolical scheme. The safe, she explained, held everything. Intercepted shipping manifests, photographs of the illegal dumping. Water samples she'd had tested without anyone knowing. A detailed ledger of every person Blackwood had crushed through his loan sharking, including my father. Enough to destroy him. Foot she wrote. My lungs stopped working. $50,000. More money than my mind could hold. Safety, security, a clean start. Everything I had ever ached for. The letter went on. The letter closed with a single line that broke me open. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 56, underscore, underscore. I wept. Then I collapsed onto the floor of that frigid, lightless barn and came apart. I wept for a mother who existed only in fragments, for a grandmother I never got to touch, for the terrified little girl I'd been, shuffled, discarded, forgotten. And I wept for the woman standing in her place now, the one who had to decide. The choice sat before me, stripped bare. Freedom or justice, running or fighting, the easy wrong or the harder right. I stared at the safe, then at the letter trembling in my grip. I thought about Mrs. Gable's worn-out pity, the kids laughing at my dollar cabin, Mark Corian's smile, the one that never reached his eyes. Every single one of them had miscalculated. They saw a damaged girl spit out by the system. None of them understood whose blood ran through me. I was Eleanor Vance's granddaughter. I reached into the hole and pressed my palm against the cold metal dial. The combination was right there in the letter, but my choice had been made long before I read it. The money was irrelevant. This barn wasn't a burden, and it wasn't a windfall. It was a battlefield. My grandmother had armed me and drawn the map. I was going to finish what she started. The safe weighed more than I expected. I hauled it from the earth, muscles burning, and dragged it to the workbench. The combination she'd left, a string of numbers that seemed random until it hit me. My mother's birthday. My fingers shook as I worked the dial. Right, left, right. The final number settled into place, a deep metallic clunk as the bolts released. I swung the heavy door wide. Everything she'd promised was there. On one side, a metal cash box packed tight with $100 bills. Even a quick look confirmed it. Tens of thousands. Enough to vanish into any life I wanted. On the other side, a thick, waterproof portfolio. The evidence. I didn't pause. I shoved the cash box aside and pulled the portfolio free. Its weight told the story. Years of my grandmother's silent, relentless war, compressed into paper and proof. Staying in the barn was not an option. Corian's people knew I was here. They'd probably been watching the property for months, and now I held the one thing that terrified them. This was the most dangerous ground I could stand on. I packed a small bag, the journal, the portfolio, the cash box stayed locked in the safe. Taking it felt wrong. That money represented her savings for a future I was choosing to walk past. This was never about getting rich. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about settling the score. I slipped through the barn's rear exit, using the dense pines as cover while I worked my way toward the road. Stayed off the open path entirely. Snow kept falling, erasing my footprints almost the moment I left them. 3 miles back to town on foot. Brutal. The cold wasn't weather, it was a living thing. It clawed through my jacket, stole the air from my lungs. Every twig that cracked in the forest sounded like someone following. Every shadow carried a threat. I wasn't some lost kid wandering through the woods anymore. I was prey. By the time Northwood's edge came into view, exhaustion had hollowed me out. My limbs were half frozen, but something harder than ice had settled into my bones. Thompson Law sat in a modest little building wedged between the diner and a hardware store. Nothing flashy. I steadied myself, drew a long breath, and pushed through the door. Inside, warmth, quiet, the smell of aging book spines and fresh coffee. A young man glanced up from behind his desk. Kind eyes, slightly wrinkled suit, early 30s maybe. My voice barely carried. I swallowed hard. I set the heavy portfolio down on his desk. Ben Thompson's face changed. Polite interest drained away, replaced by something focused, something grave. He looked at the portfolio, then at me. Something clicked behind his eyes, like he'd been carrying half a puzzle and I just walked in holding the other half. "I've been waiting for you," he said quietly. He stood, crossed to the front door, locked it, flipped the sign to closed. Then he guided me to a chair beside a small fireplace, peeled off my frozen coat, and pressed a hot mug of coffee into my hands. "Eleanor called me a few months before she passed," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "She told me what she was building, that she was leaving everything to you, that one day you'd walk through that door carrying this." He paused. "She made me promise to help you, no matter what." He settled into the chair across from mine, eyes locked on me. "She also told me to warn you. Arthur Blackwood is a dangerous man. Once we crack this portfolio open, there's no turning back. Are you sure you're ready for this?" I stared at the fire, watched the flames curl and rise. My grandmother's handwriting surfaced in my mind. Elegant, defiant. "We are not defined by what is taken from us, but by what we choose to protect," I said. My voice came out clear, steady. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 69, underscore, underscore. We burned through the rest of that day inside his office. Ben laid out every piece of the portfolio across his wide mahogany desk. What was inside exceeded anything I'd braced myself for. Dated photographs, sharp and damning, showing trucks stamped with the Blackwood and Sons logo dumping barrels into the quarry under cover of darkness. Shipping manifests for toxic chemicals, each one cross-referenced with the exact dates of the dumps. Water test results revealing contaminant levels far beyond safe limits. Poisons flowing downstream from the quarry straight toward Northwood's water supply. And then, the ledger. Dozens of names. Local people locked in endless cycles of debt to Blackwood. My father's name sat high on the list. Rick's name, right there in ink. The whole thing was a complete surgical case file. My grandmother had been a brilliant, patient investigator. Ben breathed. His professional composure fractured, replaced by something close to awe. He looked at me differently then, something new behind his gaze. Respect. Pride crashed through me like a wave. So fierce my vision blurred. She wasn't the mad recluse this town had whispered about for years. She was a hero. While Ben got to work making copies and drafting legal documents, he set me up in a spare room above the office. Being alone anywhere wasn't safe anymore. Dawn brought the first strike. Ben filed a sweeping injunction against Blackwood and Sons. Environmental contamination, illegal dumping, the full weight of Eleanor's evidence. And simultaneously delivered copies to the state's Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI. The response was instant. By midday, state police cruisers descended on the quarry. Mark Corian appeared at Ben's office door that same afternoon. The polished charm, gone. Nothing left but raw fury. He tried threats, intimidation, told me I had no concept of who I was challenging. I met his stare and said nothing. My silence hit harder than any words could have. He saw Eleanor looking back at him through my eyes, and he knew it was over. The fight wasn't finished, but momentum had shifted. Local news picked up the story first, then state outlets followed. The reclusive old woman's granddaughter had returned and blown the lid off the town's deepest buried secret. Northwood started seeing me through different eyes. Those whispers trailing me through the streets, they'd changed. No longer pity, first came shock, then gratitude. Families whose wells had turned toxic, whose kids suffered illnesses no doctor could explain, they began stepping forward. My grandmother's ledger handed them a spine. Suddenly, this wasn't about my family alone. It was about an entire town. For weeks, I lived in that cramped room, helping Ben build the case piece by piece. I gave my statement to the FBI. I memorized the names of every family Blackwood had destroyed. And in the still hours, I'd walk out to the barn. The haunted feeling had lifted. Something sacred had replaced it. I began restoring it, slow, deliberate work. Swept the floors, cleaned every tool, patched the gaping hole overhead. More of her belongings surfaced. Botany textbooks, pencil sketches of birds, a wood carving left half done. Each object was a conversation with the woman who'd saved my life from a distance. I was learning her, fragment by fragment. I was finally home. The legal grind stretched across months. Depositions, hearings, endless procedural warfare. Blackwood pushed back hard. He brought in high-dollar city attorneys who painted me as a delusional, money-hungry teenager and my grandmother as some unhinged recluse. The evidence crushed that narrative. Photographs don't fabricate themselves. Water samples don't invent contamination. A ledger backed by dozens of witnesses doesn't bend. His walls came down one by one. Arthur Blackwood caught a stack of federal indictments: illegal dumping, racketeering, fraud. His company buckled beneath lawsuits and penalties. The empire he'd raised on deception collapsed, exactly as my grandmother had foreseen. The day sentencing came, I sat in that courtroom and watched. He looked shrunken, diminished. All that power, gone. He never turned his eyes toward me, but I could feel his contempt radiating across the room. It didn't land. It couldn't reach me anymore. With the legal war behind me, a strange stillness descended. The future, once a terrifying void, stretched open like a road with no end. Northwood, which had felt so foreign at first, was becoming mine. Bill saved me a paper every morning at the store. The diner waitress had my coffee memorized. Carl made sure Ridge Road got plowed first after every storm. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was Eleanor's girl. I made my choice. The land would not be sold. The $50,000 from the safe, now locked in a bank vault, would stay untouched. I was staying. I was bringing that barn back. I used a modest portion of the money to hire a local crew. We tore out the sagging roof and rebuilt it, straightened the crooked doors, set new windows into the frames, ran electricity, ran plumbing. Slowly, with stubborn patience, decay gave way to something beautiful, light-filled, a workshop and a home in one breath. My grandmother's workbench stayed at the center of it all. Her tools hung on the pegboard. Her jars of hardware lined the shelves. Some evenings, while I sanded wood or fixed a stubborn hinge, I swore I could sense her standing beside me, a quiet presence, an approving nod. My real inheritance was never the acre of land, never the barn, not even the money. It was the choice she placed in my hands: run or fight, be the victim of my story or its author. She taught me that a thing's value isn't measured by what someone will pay. It's measured by what it's worth defending. She taught me that home isn't something handed to you. It's something you construct, something you guard with everything you've got. Standing in the doorway of my finished barn, staring out across snow-draped Vermont hills, it finally settled into my bones. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I had roots. They ran deep through this cold, unforgiving ground, tangled with the memory of a woman I never met, who gave me everything she had. Her strength became my foundation. Her love became my anchor, worth more than any fortune on earth. And so my real story in Northwood began, not an ending, a beginning, a story of rebuilding, not just a barn, but an entire life. It's about how the smallest, most dismissed things carry the greatest force. That lesson was waiting for me in a dusty barn. I carry it every single day, and I want to pass it to you, because I believe we all have our own version of that barn. Something in our lives that others wave off. Something that looks worthless on the surface, but holds a quiet strength inside it. A buried history, a truth sitting patient, waiting to be found. So what's your barn? What's the thing everyone told you was a weakness that might actually be your greatest weapon? Sit with that for a moment. And if you're willing, share it. The comment section here isn't just a feed, it's a gathering place. A room full of people who know exactly what it feels like to be written off. I read every single one. Your stories matter. They're threads in something larger we're weaving together. If my journey gave you even a sliver of hope, even a small push toward facing your own fight, then subscribe and become part of this community. Because we all deserve a place where we can trust the grain, find the foundation, and build a home for ourselves, no matter where we started. Thank you for listening.